In May 2004, a gang of 8 masked robbers raided a high-security bonded warehouse near Heathrow Airport. They were planning to steal millions of pounds worth of gold bullion and cash.
They would have got away with £33 million worth of commodities, and this certainly would have put them up there with the biggest robberies in this country.
You talk about the Millennium Dome, you talk about the Great Train Robbery. With the money that was and the gold bullion available, there's no doubt that it would have dwarfed those robberies.
Timing was everything. Timing was absolutely crucial. They had to know to be in exactly the right place at the right moment.
But instead of a jackpot, they found a flying squad. This is the spectacular story of how Scotland Yard's elite flying squad prevented what would have been Britain's biggest heist.
Gold and cash. That's what an armed gang tried to steal from a cargo warehouse at Heathrow. The gang raided the warehouse this morning.
They threatened staff with knives and cudgels.
Armed police were lying in wait for the gang, and 7 people have been arrested.
It's quite ironic that neither the police or the robbers were aware of each other's existence.
It wasn't until it reversed through the shutters that you realised that actually this was game on.
You have to say, to do a job like that, you've got to have balls of steel.
At the heart of global business, London is one of the world's largest financial centres and home to the busiest international passenger airport in the world, Heathrow. It serves over 180 destinations in more than 90 countries.
Heathrow's the main centre within the UK for not just passenger travel, but mainly its biggest income is through cargo.
You have enormous quantities of very valuable items going through Heathrow in the cargo holds of planes. Huge quantities of cash travels in the freight holds of aeroplanes every day. You know, when you get on an aeroplane and you go off somewhere on a jet, you know, literally sitting beneath your feet on a plane quite often will be a fortune in one sort of stuff or another.
With such enormous wealth in daily transit, London's Heathrow Airport has always been a magnet for serious, organised crime.
The world-famous Brinks-Mat bullion robbery happened at Heathrow Airport. In that case, the robbers actually went thinking that they were going to get cash. They actually got tons and tons of gold bullion. In the 1980s, it was said to be worth, I think, 26 million. At today's prices, it's probably, you know, several billion pounds worth.
Then, in February 2002, a highly organised criminal gang pulled off a dramatic armed robbery on the runway of Heathrow Airport.
A security van was robbed of £4.5 million from a Bahrain flight that had come into Heathrow that morning. It was the first armed robbery ever to be committed airside at Heathrow.
Heathrow's history of large-scale heists has earned the area an infamous reputation.
There are a number of people that worked as baggage handlers and behind the scenes at Heathrow who know how to operate the security systems, how to breach the security systems, and that has assisted them in all sorts of crimes, whether it be the drug importation at the top end or baggage theft in a lower tier of criminality.
There's always that promise of an opportunity to steal literally big money.
They know when high-value commodities are coming into the country that is then moved airside out into the exterior to the various warehouses where it's put in vaults until it's transported to other parts of the country. So they can not only just steal from the baggage, but they know exactly how to get it off the airport.
In the last few years, Heathrow has experienced a large shift in the pattern of crime occurring.
Starting really in the late 1990s was, of course, the huge growth of the computer industry. And computers run on information chips. And those information chips are small, but they're very valuable.
And you've only got to look at mobile phones. A small parcel of mobile phones with the SIM cards, you know, that can quite easily be contained in the back of a van, can be multi-million pounds worth of equipment.
From the mid-1990s on, these started getting stolen. And this built up a real pace into the 21st century. You know, in 2003, 2004, they were getting, you know, almost a robbery a week. And these robberies were rarely less than about £250,000 worth of goods.
With such an epidemic of organised crime, things were getting out of control.
This was a problem for the police because Heathrow Airport is actually on the outer margins of the Metropolitan Police District. But a lot of these robberies was happening either in Surrey Police Territory or the Thames Valley Police Territory or Hampshire Police Territory. And if you like, there was no joined up investigative capability there it was always somebody else's problem. So for the thieves, it was almost an ideal situation.
To the point where a number of major companies were looking at pulling out and relocating over onto the continent. So it became an issue at government level.
Scotland Yard's Flying Squad, an elite crime-fighting unit combating the most violent of London's armed criminals. They were drafted in with the formidable task of cracking down on the key criminals and bringing them to justice.
The Flying Squad is the only detective branch on mainland UK that has detectives who are authorised for surveillance and armed operations and carry firearms. There isn't another unit in the country that has that capability.
The Flying Squad would investigate crimes from cradle to grave, and that would be from the initial allegation being investigative to any proactive operation that was subsequently mounted to identify and arrest those that were responsible for the crime.
If it's armed robbery anywhere in the London area, it's a job for the Flying Squad.
In March 2003, Operation Grafton was formed with the specific task of combating organised crime in the Heathrow area.
A dedicated team of officers, you know, with a very good surveillance capacity, you know, criminal intelligence background and so forth, were put in place to try and identify who was doing this, because there was always a feeling that it could only be a very small cartel of people who were really behind nearly all of these crimes.
Operation Grafton, when it looked at the profile of the criminals that were operating in those early days in and around Heathrow, identified something like 200 to 300 criminals that lived down the M4 corridor.
There's two types of major league criminal been working at the airport over the years. There are thieves who steal things from the warehouses by sleight of hand, by literally prizing open boxes and taking out the valuable contents. And there are robbers. These are the people who go in with guns, put them in somebody's face and say, give me the goods.
But what you had is a small number of criminals that were organising, if you use in an old terminology, the draftsmen that put the jobs together. And then they would bring in other criminal elements of a lesser nature, usually criminals that had ducked underneath the police radar because they hadn't quite reached the level of criminality that brought them to notice.
Operation Grafton was set up to combat the number of crime that was occurring in and around Heathrow Airport. It was established to set up lines of communication between the three force areas, namely Surrey, the Metropolitan Police and Thames Valley area, so that they all worked in a coordinated fashion.
But Operation Grafton was facing other challenges.
All of the criminals that operate in and around Heathrow Airport are very tight-knit. They're infamously famous to try and infiltrate, almost impossible at the end of the day. We found that whenever we drove into Stanwell and we walked into local pubs and it was just like a Wild West, it just went quiet and you know, they already knew we were there 10 minutes before we turned up. It's quite an experience.
The police were struggling to infiltrate the tight band of criminals operating in the Heathrow area. To catch the perpetrators, they desperately needed information. But with such a tight network of criminals operating in the area, How would the flying squad be able to penetrate the inner criminal fraternity? After a series of high-value robberies in and around London's Heathrow Airport, the British government turned to Scotland Yard's flying squad to find those responsible and tackle the high crime levels. In March 2003, Operation Grafton was formed, but the flying squad was struggling to clamp down on the close-knit community of criminals. However, their fortunes were about to change when the police arrested a baggage handler thief who came forward as a supergrass.
An assisting offender, as they're officially known, but in old parlance a supergrass, came forward.
I'm looking for a name. That's all I'm after, a name.
John Beach.
The supergrass told us that John Beach was the man responsible for organising the crime in 2002.
John Beach, age 34, from Stanwell.
John Beach, leader of the gang, bit of form.
That placed him at the top of the list for flying squad attention in pursuing that investigation, and we placed him under surveillance.
He was a very important criminal spider sitting at the centre of a large criminal web.
With John Beach named as a key player in Heathrow's criminal underworld, the investigation was slowly uncovering more background information.
Beach worked for a logistics company around Heathrow Airport. Their business was arranging truck movements and drivers to move goods out of the airport to various locations.
He's worked with the baggage handlers, he's familiar with the security systems, and has been involved at various levels of criminality in and around Heathrow Airport over a number of years, and is well connected with the criminal fraternity that operate in and around Heathrow Airport.
The police reviewed their records, examining the crimes that had occurred over the last 2 years at Heathrow.
In almost every case, the details of where these shipments would be at any one time, how they were moving, who was driving and where they were going, was either known directly to John Beach or to somebody else that they suspected of feeding information to John Beach.
He was the main player in organising not just the crime, but the individuals that were recruited with their various individual skills. And then bringing in the smaller bit part players just to commit the crime on the day.
So clearly, John Beach is the problem. You know, we know he has criminal tendencies. He's now becoming very, very successful. If we take out Beach, it'll be like decapitating the snake.
Operation Grafton now needed to establish John Beach's criminal network.
That was done by painstaking hours and hours of surveillance, monitoring his movements, seeing who he was meeting, doing the research on those individuals, identifying them, placing them under surveillance. And on a day-to-day, week-on-week basis, we built a picture up.
It was associating with other well-known criminals in and around that area.
John Beach was seen having various meetings with criminals known to the police. Chris Smith, aged 28, from Slough. And Martin Nolan, aged 28, from Berkshire.
Nolan was already a suspect for some robberies as far as the police were concerned. There were links there that led them to think that Nolan was actively involved in some truck hijacks. He'd been involved in some cash robberies, they thought. Of course, now this really jacked up the police interest.
Martin Nolan was John Beach's right-hand man. He was a middle-of-the-road type criminal, one that had grew up with criminality and was escalating into far more serious offences. He was known to police, both in Thames Valley and the Metropolitan Police area, and was at that stage on bail for armed robbery. Chris Smith was Martin Nolan's lieutenant, and as such was carrying out his instructions.
The police were certain these men were planning a major robbery.
We know that Beach has got access to information about valuable cargoes. Now he's meeting regularly with people we suspect are actively involved in armed robberies.
John Beach was very clever regarding all his meetings. Whilst under surveillance, the criminals would be recorded meeting together in various different secluded places where it was difficult for the police to conduct observations on them. They would meet in public houses where it was very difficult for somebody from the outside to come into the public house without being compromised.
We knew that he was targeting a higher commodity goods coming into the country, so we knew that they would have to go into a warehouse and that would focus our attention. The trick was which warehouse.
At such a crucial stage in the operation, the flying squad needed to establish the target warehouse. It was during the arduous undercover surveillance that officers were about to witness and film something extraordinary.
The three men were seen gathering around the side of a white panel truck, which was covered along its sides in road dirt. And at one point, Nolan takes his finger and he starts to draw a diagram in the dirt on the side of the truck, which shows certain locations.
And it was only when the lads back in the office were poring over the video footage and trying to work out what it was he was talking about. And it came to a couple of the lads in the office that, from their local knowledge, that he was actually drawing out the Swissport location.
This was the first time we identified that they had a target in mind.
Video footage down here that we'd like you to have a look at.
Clearly he thought if he just drew it in the side of a truck, the truck would be gone, the evidence would be lost, but what he didn't take into account was that somewhere a long way back, Scotland Yard surveillance teams were actually captured him drawing that map.
We knew that we were game on. We knew that they were at the advanced stages of committing an offence. It raises the stakes, because you know that they're towards the end game. Nobody wants to be the one that actually compromises a job and blows it out. So it puts pressure on everybody.
Swissport provides global airport and aviation services for over 100 million passengers. Situated in 36 countries, it is also the world's largest cargo handling company, with a staggering turnover in 2010 of approximately 1.3 billion euros.
They have a number of bonded warehouses around the world where, say, cargoes coming in, for instance, to Heathrow Airport need to be cleared by customs, but it would hold up the airline business if that was done at the airport. So it's shifted out of the airport premises out to a big warehouse like Swissport. The warehouse has layers of security, starting with, electrified perimeter fences, very high fences with razor wire on top to stop people actually climbing over into their premises. Then they have very, very strictly controlled access for both people and vehicles in and out of this vast hangar of a building.
Once inside the high-security warehouse, there is a large floor space with a number of roller shutters to the front and back of the building for the delivery of cargo. High-value goods such as cash, gold, precious cargo, metals and stones are delivered through a separate entrance, which leads directly to an impregnable, secure vault area.
Probably its biggest weapon that they have in keeping things secure is the fact that it's anonymous. Unless you have good inside information about what's in a particular truck coming or going, you don't know exactly what's there.
But in this case, the criminals had access to crucial high-security information.
Timing was absolutely crucial. They had to know to be in exactly the right place at the right moment. And you can't do that unless you've got an inside man's information.
Every robbery, every job in and around Heathrow Airport I've ever been involved in has always had an inside agent.
John Beach was very clever because he never contacted the inside agent directly, but went through a third party.
He knew what the valuable cargo was, how big it was, how much there'd be of it.
Armed with this crucial intelligence, The flying squad arranged meetings with Swissport officials to explain their findings.
We gained access to what commodities were being flown in and out of Heathrow Airport and their times of arrival.
Swissport's schedule of high-value cargo deliveries revealed that the depot was due to receive a huge consignment of cash and gold bullion worth £33 million. These would be arriving separately on planes and delivered to the warehouse on the same day.
The police were fairly confident they knew which day the robbers were going to strike, because the police, of course, also knew which day the gold bullion and the 3.5 tons of cash money were going to be arriving almost simultaneously at Swissport.
Once we had established that there was gold and large value consignment of cash coming into the country on the day, we very quickly put an operational plan in place to surround the area with covert officers.
When we were looking at the arrest phase for this operation, a number of options are available. One is to keep it completely covert and wait for the villains to come on plot. Or the second option is to actually infiltrate the warehouse and put undercover cops into the warehouse. But we weren't sure how many inside agents there were. To actually expose ourselves into the warehouse would have given certain individuals knowledge that would then have been passed to Beach.
Based on the information we had, it was like a jigsaw. We had identified a venue, but we were missing the pieces of how they were actually going to commit it, or who was actually going to commit it.
The police plans and the robbers' plans were running in parallel together, and they were both building up to a climax. So, like a game of chess almost, the police were making their plans to counter the robbers.
With the investigation gathering full momentum, how would the flying squad be able to uncover the robbers' plans to carry out Britain's biggest heist before it was too late? Career criminal John Beach had expertly brought together his criminal associates Martin Nolan and Chris Smith to plan Britain's biggest heist. But little did they know that their every movement was being watched. In 2004, after a lengthy covert operation using specialized surveillance and intelligence, the flying squad were piecing together the robbers' plans to steal an estimated £33 million of cash and gold from Swissport, a high-security cargo handling company at Heathrow. But the identity of the other gang members and how they were plotting to carry out the heist was still unknown. To counter any of the robbers' plans, the flying squad decided they would have to deploy a pavement ambush, the most dangerous part of their police work.
The technical term is armed intervention. Whether it be a hard stop on a vehicle, on suspects with firearms in their hands, going across the pavement, as we call it, at the point of committing an armed robbery.
It gives you the maximum amount of evidence that can be achieved as you're actually taking them out just prior to them committing the offence.
So whilst it is the most dangerous part of the operation for a flying squad officer, it is the most important part of any conclusion of an operation to get the quality of evidence we need to convict.
A pavement ambush is a high-risk strategy that has many dangers, not only to the police, also to the offenders, but more importantly to the public themselves.
Safety is always a paramount concern. We won't put a pavement ambush in if it will put people or members of the public in danger. We would rather leave it and fall back to other tactics.
There have been many, many times when armed operations in these circumstances have gone wrong and people have been shot, the police have shot. In my career, many people in the commission of robberies, and on occasions I've known people personally who've been shot and wounded by robbers during this kind of operation.
With such a risky strategy, the operation needed to be flawless. But to do this, the police needed the cooperation of Swissport in helping them catch the criminals.
We had to impress on the Swissport senior management that this had to be just like any other day at the Swissport depot. Should anything have been out of the ordinary, then the inside agent may well have realised that, and the whole operation would have been compromised.
It's an awkward conversation because paramount to everybody's thoughts was the safety of the employees at Swissport. We had to make sure that we didn't put those individuals in any risk.
It was very difficult to plan for every contingency when you have such limited information and just have the venue without knowing how it was going to be committed or how many people were actually going to commit the offence.
We couldn't guarantee the successful conclusion of the operation by infiltrating the workforce because we didn't know how many inside agents there were.
With Heathrow and Swissport's full assistance, the flying squad were edging closer to completing their mission. But time was fast running out. Who and how the criminals were planning to execute their robbery was still unknown.
We could only go on our previous intelligence, and that was the robbery in 2002. That was committed by two men dressed as BA staff, carrying a firearm, and this robbery was committed airside. So we had no idea whether the robbery was going to be committed when the plane landed, or whilst it was travelling to the Swissport depot, or actually at the Swissport depot itself. There were a number of ways they could have committed this offence, and we had to be prepared for every one of them.
Every crime syndicate is made up differently. There's usually a draftsman that puts the job together, but where you've got a job like Swissport, it didn't just need people to drive the vans, put the job together, who had the contacts to get rid of the high-value commodities after the robbery. You needed muscle on the day. Beach, the Nolans would have all known individuals that they could call on.
With such high stakes, the flying squad's ambush tactics needed to be perfect. On the 17th of May 2004, the day of the heist had finally arrived.
There was a briefing in the early hours of the morning, where each officer and each unit was assigned specific tasks. Each officer was briefed that he had to be aware of his surroundings and not to disturb the environment around Heathrow Airport, as this may well compromise the operation.
The majority were surveillance and firearms operatives because of the type of work we were doing on the day. They were supported by arrest teams. So there was a mixture of false firearms officers, flying squad armed arrest cars, surveillance personnel who were armed themselves for their own protection. We also had dog handlers, other specialists and other agencies that were present because of the type of people, criminality we were dealing with.
There was over 100 police officers deployed in and around Heathrow Airport and around the Swissport depot.
To have over 100 officers to brief before the deployment on the day, is a massive task, and I hadn't seen the like of that in my service. Certainly within my career, this is the biggest police operation that I'd been involved in, and possibly throughout the country.
Ready?
The flying squad waited patiently with adrenaline-fueled anticipation for the other gang members to show themselves.
I then sat off away from the actual venue, leaving the actual control of the operation to Wilf Pickles. He was responsible on the day for giving the attack, to put in the arrest phase at the appropriate moment.
This was a large operation, deploying a number of officers in various vehicles in and around Heathrow Airport, going from airside all the way to the Swissport depot. Some of those officers were deployed in a van into the car park of the Swissport area.
It was now a waiting game.
I was sitting a distance away from the venue with a reporter and a photographer from a national newspaper who had been authorised to cover the robbery.
As a trusted member of the British press, crime reporter Jeff Edwards had been promised exclusive access to a flying squad operation.
So I contacted my photographer, Roger Allen, and obviously very excited about what might be coming. We all met early in the morning in North London with Superintendent Phillips, and we all got in a flying squad car and we drove west to close to Heathrow Airport.
Whilst sitting away from Swissport, waiting for the events to unfold, it's always a nerve-wracking experience. You know that we've got an operation that's likely to result in arrests, It's just knowing when you're apprehensive, if something goes wrong, if the villains get spooked because they see a cop.
Both the police and my photographer and me were all kind of, we're quite, buzzing really with what might be going to happen.
Early in the morning, the first plane landed at Heathrow.
The cargo that arrived first was the cash, which arrived on a flight from somewhere in Europe, and it was quickly moved from the cargo hold of the plane into a secure truck, and it then drove about 2 miles across the airport to Swissport. And all the way, it was shadowed covertly by the police to make sure it arrived safely.
When the cash arrived at the depot, it was taken from the van by the custodians and put into the vault.
I'm being updated all the time on different sources of intelligence. There's a lot of communication, a lot of information coming in that you need to monitor.
Mr. Phillips had several different phones, I seem to recall, with him, and one or other of his phones would ring and people would say to him, the first cargo has landed and it's been moved to the warehouse and all's quiet. And, he turned around to me and he said, it's arrived at Swissport and it's got inside. There's no sign of the robbers. This doesn't look good. I think, if it was going to happen, it would have happened by now. And I think that fairly shortly, I'm going to instruct my people to pack up for the day and go home.
As the police started contemplating whether the heist was actually going to happen, at approximately 9:30 a.m, a white van arrived at the Swissport depot.
Chris Smith and the robbers turned up in a van that had been stolen and was using false index plates on the van. They gained access to Swissport by using forged papers.
The robbers' van parked in the Swissport car park.
What they were unaware of was that a police van with firearms officers inside was only a few metres away from them. And in fact, it was quite ironic that neither the police or the robbers were aware of each other's existence. Literally side by side.
Very shortly afterwards, the plane carrying the gold bullion touched down. From the airport and covertly shadowed by the police, it was then delivered to the Swissport warehouse. However, the lorry was too large to drive straight into the high-security vaulted area. The gold was instead offloaded onto the warehouse floor before it would then be taken to the vault.
There will be a short window of opportunity where this load of bullion will be vulnerable is when it's physically unloaded back from the back of the truck that's just brought it from the airport, and it's got to move across this warehouse floor to the secure compound.
It was now or never.
After the gold had been delivered, the white van then all of a sudden immediately reversed back through the shutters. We had no idea how the actual robbery was going to take place. But when the van actually went through the shutters, we knew then that this was the offence.
Everyone up until that point could be forgiven for thinking it was another delivery van coming in and reversing up to the shutters. It wasn't until it reversed through the shutters that you realised that actually this was game on. This was actually happening.
With its engine still racing, the van was jammed in one of the roller shutters.
8 men came out from the van and immediately started to steal the gold. And 2 of them ran into the vault area where they were going to steal the cash and the diamonds. The gang were armed with wooden staves and knives, but often they intimated that they had guns in their possession. And they were shouting and being aggressive with these weapons, which frightened the Swissport staff.
They knew where the vaults were and they knew where the gold bullion was. And some started to put the gold bullion on the van, others went for the vaults where the money was. They clearly knew what was where from the information they'd been given.
Attack! Attack! Attack!
The flying squad swooped in with their pavement ambush as the masked robbers were dragging the gold bullion onto their van.
Once I heard the attack go in, I then, with my driver and the 2 press reporters, drove straight to Swissport.
The armed police expertly put their ambush operation into action.
The scene inside the warehouse at the time of the robbery and when the police were deployed would have been absolute chaos. There was 8 robbers inside the warehouse, along with Swissport staff as well. And obviously the firearms officers then had to deploy and identify the robbers inside the warehouse. The whole point of the firearms officers deploying is the speed at which they deploy. They would have seen the robbers inside carrying the gold and immediately contained them within the warehouse. The firearms officers, once they went into the depot, immediately contained the area and arrested those suspects who were nearby.
The police had successfully managed to contain the area and arrest the masked robbers. But amidst the chaos, 2 of the gang members managed to escape.
One of the suspects ran along the side of the warehouse and escaped over a security fence. Another one of the suspects ran through the warehouse and then hijacked a van.
As most of the masked robbers were arrested and detained, the flying squad now had a manhunt on their hands. The flying squad were planning to foil a gang of masked robbers as they attempted to carry out Britain's biggest heist at the world's largest cargo handling company, Swissport. But despite having pieced together crucial information, they were unable to identify the other gang members or how they were planning to carry out the robbery. Instead, the flying squad had to prepare for every eventuality. Much to everyone's surprise, when a white van containing 8 masked robbers reversed at high speed into the Swissport warehouse shutters, the flying squad immediately deployed their pavement ambush. They quickly captured and detained most of the criminals, but during the raid, 2 of the gang members had managed to escape.
As we swept into the yard, off to our right, I could see a roller shutter door, and jammed halfway through this roller shutter door was a white Mercedes Sprinter van that had obviously been smashed backwards through the door as the door was shutting, so it was sort of jammed in there. Barry said to me, "Jeff, wait here, I'm just going to make sure everything's okay." And he sort of jumped off the police car, ducked under the barrier.
When I walked into the warehouse, it was just a scene of utter devastation. You've got the van that smashed through the shutters, and then you've got, in the good old-fashioned way, the villains laid out on the floor with handcuffs on.
Within 60 seconds, he was out, big smile on his face, and he said, "Come inside." He said, "I've got something really interesting to show you." We've got them, they're all laid out. The actual expression he used, I love it, he said, "They're all laid out like ham salads." We walked into the warehouse, and sure enough, at various locations around the floor, there were men lying face down. Most of them by this point had been handcuffed, but they hadn't been moved from where the police had actually ordered them to the floor.
For the first time, the identities of the masked robbers would be revealed. Chris Smith, aged 28, from Slough. Derek Sheehan, aged 32, from Hammersmith. John Davis, aged 20, from Slough. James Fox, aged 30, from Ascot. Anthony Charles, aged 34, of No Fixed Abode. Alan Lamont, aged 30, of Slough.
One of them was very upset, did a lot of shouting and swearing and made a lot of threats to the police and to me and to others. It was, it's water off a duck's back. You expect that sort of thing in those circumstances. We were only probably 2 minutes behind the action. And it was an extraordinary sight because it was slightly eerie because there was really no movement, not much going on at this stage because clearly the police were just holding the situation while other police vehicles were brought there to take the prisoners away.
The crime scene was very fresh.
My photographer started to photograph pretty much everything he could see. One of the robbers, the police had grabbed him, they'd handcuffed him and they sort of sat him down and he still had a sort of a ski mask pulled down over his face. And as we walked round there, Superintendent Phillips said to a couple of his officers, "Let's have a look and see who he is." And they rolled up the mask and it was this guy, James Fox.
Fox was actually sitting up against one of the boxes of bullion with what we dubbed it the Hamlet moment.
You can imagine that that tune cutting in at that point of, you know, when his realisation of how his day had suddenly all gone terribly wrong. It's probably, you know, one of the best, if not the best, scoop of a lengthy career as a crime reporter.
Once they'd taken their photographs and finished, I then got them away and then got on with the strategic stuff and left Wilf to get on with the crime scene. What you don't need is too many people tramping around who don't need to be there. It is a crime scene at the end of the day and has to be managed in a certain way.
The flying squad were hugely relieved the pavement ambush deployed successfully and no one was harmed. But they knew they still had a manhunt on their hands.
One robber was on the loose. He had run down the yard at the back of the warehouse, and the next premises along was an Esso fuel depot that supplied aviation gas to Heathrow. And he got over the fence into that depot, chased by the police, but had been last seen disappearing into that tank farm.
Whenever somebody gets away, there's always a thought that it's the informant that gets away. And on this occasion, no, we didn't have an informant. The only informant we had was the supergrass that put us onto this gang in the first place. What happened on the day was just good luck on the part of the villain, bad luck on ours.
With one of the robbers disappearing without a trace, there was a crucial chase to catch the other fleeing gang member. His name, Stephen Nolan, aged 23, of Raysbury. He was Martin Nolan's younger brother.
He forced the driver out of the cab, jumped in the cab of this 2.5-ton white truck, gunned the engine, gone racing out of the yard, smashed through the drop-down barrier on the exit, tore off into the side streets around Heathrow, hotly followed by the police, and there was a hair-raising car chase. Went on for about 15 minutes until Nolan drove onto a small housing estate nearby, crashed the truck into a wall, jumped out and ran fairly predictably to the house of his girlfriend. Within minutes, the police had surrounded the flats and he was arrested.
The flying squad now needed to round up Martin Nolan and John Beach. These criminals tried to keep their hands clean by not taking part, but the net around them was tightening.
As soon as Nolan realised that the police had arrested his accomplices, Nolan then left London and travelled to the West Midlands. Martin Nolan was eventually arrested at East Midlands Airport when he was awaiting the arrival of a friend.
Beach, of course, who was the main architect of the job, had an alibi for the robbery itself. He was at work back at Heathrow Airport, probably waiting for the joyous news that there'd been an enormous robbery and that it had been a clean getaway.
On the day of the robbery, John Beach was conducting his deliveries as usual. However, what he didn't realise was he was under surveillance. And as soon as the robbery took place, he received a telephone call, and one of the surveillance officers noted that he appeared agitated when he took that call. After the robbery, Beach got back in his van and drove past the Swissport depot.
In July 2004, 2 months after the foiled Swissport robbery attempt, the flying squad arrested John Beach once they had evidence of his involvement in the 2002 robbery at Heathrow Airport. He was charged for both offences. With all the criminals safely in police custody, their trial dates were set. The men pleaded guilty to conspiracy to rob Swissport, except Martin Nolan and John Beach.
You have been found guilty.
Whilst Martin Nolan was found guilty, the jury were unable to reach a verdict on John Beach. In his 2006 retrial, John Beach was finally found guilty for both the Swissport and the £4.5 million airside robbery in 2002. Following the successful outcome of the Swissport investigation, organised crime in and around Heathrow Airport fell by a dramatic 84%.
And that was a combination of a number of operations that had been conducted by Operation Grafton and by the Flying Squad in partnership with Customs and Excise, Thames Valley and Surrey. But predominantly, the high-profile operation that really drove down, got the deterrent message out that the Met Police had actually got a grip of crime in that area was Swissport.
With the reduction of crime in and around Heathrow, it also showed the role that John Beach was playing in crime around Heathrow Airport.
If the gang had got away with all the gold and all the money that was available to them that morning, it would have been, without any question, Britain's biggest ever heist.